story begins a day before the tragic event in October 1972. A group of university students from Montevideo, Uruguay, had just won a rugby match. Their victory meant they would move on to play in Chile. To save costs, they decided to charter a plane owned by the Air Force. The plane carried 45 people, the rugby team, coaching staff, and a few family members. On their journey from Montevideo to Santiago, Chile, they had to cross the towering Andes Mountains. Inside the plane, laughter and excitement filled the air. For many of them, this was their first match abroad. But as they entered the Andes, turbulence shook the plane. At first, they brushed it off as something normal. Then, a violent jolt threw them into panic. The pilot fought to regain control, but unbeknownst to him, the plane was already too close to the mountain range. It crashed into the Andes, the impact tearing the fuselage apart from the tail. The aftermath was catastrophic. Some passengers survived, others were critically injured. Many lost their lives on impact. Those who made it through the crash scrambled to help each other amid the chaos. The freezing snowstorm outside only worsened their ordeal. The survivors begged the dying pilot to radio for help. Weak and fading, he could only pray for their safety. That night, they huddled in the bitter cold, screaming into the darkness, unable to comprehend the horror of what had just happened. The next morning, the survivors emerged to feel the warmth of the sun. The rugby team gathered, led by their captain, Marcelo. He instructed them to remove the bodies from the wreckage and rearrange the seats for space. They also scavenged through luggage, gathering all the food they could find into a single pile. Outside the wreckage, they counted 11 dead on the second day. Marcelo rationed the food carefully. Each person received only a tiny portion to conserve supplies. That night, they crowded together in the broken fuselage, using suitcases to seal gaps and keep the cold out. Marcelo encouraged his team, reminding them that rescue efforts must have already begun. On the third day, Nando, one of the passengers, woke from unconsciousness. He asked what had happened. His friends explained the crash and their current predicament. Nando then inquired about his mother and sister. Marcelo told him that his sister, Susie, had initially survived but was in critical condition. Tragically, his mother had passed away. Meanwhile, another passenger, Vito, used sunlight to melt snow for drinking water. Others made a large X in the snow, hoping it would help rescuers spot them. Later that day, they spotted a passing airplane and waved frantically for help. Cheers erupted. They were sure they had been seen. But as the hours passed, no help arrived. That night, hunger gnawed at their spirits, and they shared stories to keep hope alive. By the fourth day, their food supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. A passenger named Numa suggested climbing to the plane's tail section, where the batteries were stored, hoping they could use them to power the radio. Without proper preparation, 4 of them set off to find the tail. After hours of walking, they rested and realized just how isolated they were. From a distance, the wreckage was almost invisible, likely the reason search teams hadn't found them yet. Suddenly, the sound of an avalanche rumbled through the mountains, forcing them to retreat. By the 6th day, hunger had become unbearable. Nando said to Vito that they wouldn't starve if they ate the flesh of their friends who had passed away. This idea quickly became the center of their discussion. Roberto and Vito agreed, as it seemed to be their only means of survival. Meanwhile, Marcelo and Numa strongly opposed the idea. To them, these bodies were their friends. It felt unimaginable to consume them. Marcelo added that if such an act were to happen, it should only be done with explicit permission from the deceased beforehand. This sparked a heated debate among the survivors. The choice was agonizing: either eat the bodies of their friends or face death by starvation. Roberto pointed out that their condition was worsening, emphasizing that even their urine had turned black, a sign of severe dehydration and malnutrition. The next morning, on the 8th day, desperation escalated. Some survivors began chewing on leather from their shoes and even tobacco from cigarettes. Sadly, Nando's younger sister, Susie, could no longer endure the harsh conditions. She passed away, leaving Nando heartbroken. With a heavy heart, he buried his sister beneath the snow. Now, only 27 people remained alive. On the 9th day, snow began to fall once again, forcing the survivors to stay huddled inside the wreckage of the plane. Vito expressed his resolve, saying, "If I die, I will let my body be eaten by my friends." Inspired by this, Roberto, Nando, Gustavo, and several others also voiced their consent. "If I die, I give you permission to use my body for food. Keep living." A few survivors hesitantly ventured outside to retrieve meat from the bodies, beginning the grim act of survival cannibalism. However, Marcelo and some others still refused to partake. The next day, the group collected more flesh, carefully cutting it in a secluded area so no one could identify whose body the pieces had come from. Later that afternoon, while searching through luggage, the survivors discovered a small, water-damaged radio. Desperately, they tried to repair it. Those who had regained some strength worked on finding a signal, while Marcelo and Numa, weak from hunger, sat idly inside the fuselage. The fragile hope was shattered when they overheard a radio broadcast reporting that the search for their plane had been suspended until the snow melted the following year. The announcement devastated everyone. Marcelo, who had been a symbol of optimism, finally gave in to despair. He urged the others to eat, though Numa remained resolute in his refusal. Driven by determination, Numa and 2 others set out to find the plane's tail section. After a long trek, they found parts of the wreckage and tragically discovered the bodies of some passengers who had been ejected upon impact. As the sun set, Numa insisted on continuing the journey, but they became trapped in the snow. That night, they clung to each other for warmth under the merciless cold. A miracle happened the next day. The group slid back down to the main fuselage on a patch of ice, returning to their starting point. During a group discussion, Nando proposed a daring plan to climb over the mountains, convinced that Chile lay just beyond. However, he stressed that they would need strength for such a journey, which meant consuming more meat. Numa, who had resisted eating so far, finally gave in, realizing it was their only hope. As he began to eat, he saw a spark of hope. Nando, once gravely injured, was now regaining his strength. Determined to prepare for the grueling trek, Nando began training for long-distance walking. The survivors' resolve deepened. They would fight to live, no matter how desperate the circumstances. In summary, they had been stranded for 17 days, and their condition was beginning to improve. They even joked around to lift their spirits. However, disaster struck again. Suddenly, an avalanche buried the entire group under the snow. Some managed to escape and immediately worked to rescue their trapped companions. While several survivors were pulled out alive, others couldn't be saved and tragically passed away, including Marcelo. Not long after, another avalanche hit, burying them once more. Fortunately, Numa managed to create an air pocket, allowing the group to breathe. By the 18th day, now their second day trapped under the snow, hunger forced the survivors to consume the bodies of their recently deceased friends. Roberto, a medical student, calmly dissected the corpses, but the sight pushed Numa to his limit. Stressed and emotional, he tried to break a window, injuring his leg in the process. 2 days later, Numa attempted to open the window again and discovered the weather had cleared. One by one, the survivors crawled out, relieved to feel alive once more. They started clearing the snow from the plane wreckage, though injuries among them were worsening. Alfaro, seeing Numa's deteriorating state, urged him to conserve his energy, explaining that even laws can be bent for survival. Slowly, Numa began to understand Alfaro's reasoning. Meanwhile, Nando, frustrated with inaction, urged his friends to join him in finding a way out. However, the others refused, deeming the journey impossible with snow still so deep. As his companions retreated to the plane, Nando continued to push Roberto to accompany him, but Roberto refused. By the 34th day, warmer weather had caused the snow to begin melting. However, Alfaro's condition grew critical, and he succumbed to his injuries. Gustavo, also a medical student, pressed Roberto to take action, insisting that their medical skills were useless in this dire situation. Eventually, 4 survivors, Nando, Roberto, Tintin, and Numa, set out to find a route home. Though Numa's injured leg made the journey difficult, he forced himself to join. They headed south toward Argentina. However, Numa's condition worsened due to an infected wound, forcing him to return to the plane alone. Back at the wreckage, Numa became feverish and weak. Sadly, another companion also passed away during the night. The next day, Nando and the others returned to the plane, bringing good news. They had found the tail section of the plane. It had been flung far in the opposite direction. There, they discovered food, cigarettes, and, most importantly, the battery they had been searching for. Since it was too heavy to carry back, they decided to bring the radio to the tail section instead. That afternoon, they returned with Roy, an electronics student. He successfully connected the battery to the radio, managing to power it up, though they were unable to establish communication. Back at the fuselage, the survivors had grown accustomed to eating human flesh, which had become a routine for survival. However, Numa's condition worsened, and he refused to eat. Overcome with fear, he confided in Nando that he didn't expect to live much longer. At the tail section, the group kept trying to get the radio to work, but had no success. While searching through the debris, Tintin found waterproof fabric, which they took back to the fuselage to use as blankets for their outdoor treks. Upon their return, they informed the others about the radio's failure, but shared their discovery of the fabric. The next day, the group heard over the radio that the search for the Uruguayan plane would resume. This news gave them a glimmer of hope. Roberto hesitated about continuing the journey, but Nando insisted they couldn't rely solely on rescue teams. Inside the plane, Numa's condition worsened. In his final moments, he told Nando that his body could be used by his friends to survive. Despite their efforts to care for him, Numa passed away the next morning. In his pocket, they found a note that read, "There is no greater love than sacrificing oneself for friends." By the 61st day, only 16 survivors remained. That morning, Nando, Roberto, and Tintin embarked on their westward journey toward Chile. Their friends bid them farewell with prayers and words of encouragement. The weather was clear, and the 3 navigated the Andes Mountains. When night fell, they slept under their waterproof fabric. Each day, they climbed further, but their spirits wavered upon seeing the vast expanse of the Andes still ahead. They debated whether to turn back or press on, but Nando refused to give up, saying, "It's better to die trying than to die doing nothing." Tintin sacrificed his provisions for Roberto and Nando and returned to the fuselage. Over the next several days, Nando and Roberto advanced with favorable weather. Finally, they reached a valley and descended to find a rocky mountain free of snow, a sign they were nearing safety. After resting and repairing their shoes, they continued. The next day, they found a river and drank eagerly. At the same time, they saw a mountain policeman. Shouting for help, they revealed their identities. The officer immediately assisted them and reported to the Chilean SR team. While awaiting rescue, Nando and Roberto were treated to a meal, the best food they had ever tasted. News of their survival spread like wildfire. Back at the fuselage, their friends heard the reports over the radio, overwhelmed with emotion and joy. They packed their belongings and prepared to be rescued. Gustavo carefully collected mementos of their fallen friends, while Roberto buried the remaining flesh they had used for survival. On December 22nd, 71 days after the crash, helicopters arrived to rescue the survivors. Cheers and cries of relief filled the air as the 16 remaining individuals were flown to safety. Reunited with their families in Chile, they were taken to hospitals for care. The world was stunned by their miraculous survival, but the survivors would never forget the sacrifices of their friends who had given them a chance to live.